Hello, everybody, and welcome to June's Fic Night. We are, for once, starting just about right on time. Uh, I am going to be reading tonight the featured story that was chosen out of our two nominees. This one is chapter 2 of a two-chapter story, Lazy Days, written by Ava or Just a Willow Tree. I'm going to leave out the periods for our purpose. But this particular chapter and this entry were actually posted to the archives here at hpfanfictalk.com as part of a challenge. We've had a couple of stories now that were originally posted as part of a challenge, and this particular story was posted as part of the domesticity challenge, which was held by another one of our members, Forever Dreaming. And this story, Lazy Days, was actually the winner of the challenge, which had an absolutely incredible number of wonderful entries. From what we have heard from the challenge host, it was an incredibly hard decision, but anybody who's read Lazy Days knows that this particular story was fully deserving of the accolades that it got, and fully deserving of being a choice for feature for our authors on Fic Night. So without further ado, I am going to jump right into the story. There is, full warning, some rated M language for anybody out there, but I think you will find that it serves the story well. So we're going to go ahead and go through with it full bore. Wake up in a soft bed, with the light floating through the windows and her pudgy little toddler sleeping beside her, was truly a dream. Astoria wrapped her arm gently around her baby and hugged him close to her. He briefly squirmed in protest before squishing himself against her side and falling back into a peaceful sleep. Despite the fact that Scorpius had woken up approximately 5 times throughout the night, it was still the best sleep Astoria had gotten in weeks. So she was currently feeling very charitable towards her little urchin. She lifted her head off the pillow, searching for the other blonde head, which should have been resting on the other side of Scorpius. His side of the bed was empty, though, probably going through his early morning routine of cleaning the home. She nestled back into her delightfully fluffy pillow and drifted back into a soothing, lilting sleep. Sometime later, she woke once again when the door to the bedroom cracked open, and Draco, dressed in a plain white t-shirt and green pajama bottoms, stepped into their room. The intricate tattoo of vines and roses covering his dark mark twisted around his arm as he gazed at her. He made his way to her side of the bed, and though, as usual, his face betrayed little emotion, the backs of his fingers brushed so tenderly against her cheeks that her toes curled under the covers. Since Hogwarts, Draco had become much more reserved. His youthful tendencies to throw entitled tantrums, along with all bullshit prejudice that he'd adopted at the time, thankfully matured into something more palatable. The ability to remain calm and stoic under even the most strenuous circumstances. Everything about Draco when she'd met him after Hogwarts had been so different from Astoria's usually scathing, honest responses to everything. But she'd soon discovered that his emotions were within the openness of his body language and the subtle inflections of his voice. Good morning, said Astoria, stretching carefully so as not to disturb her little toddler. Morning, he said, trailing his fingertips down her neck. Perhaps the most comfortable wake-up call ever. How are you feeling today? I know you were exhausted while reading Dr. Seuss to Scorpius last night. I feel well rested for once, she said, smiling up at him through her bleary morning gaze. That's good, because I just came back from the grocery store. I'm going to make tteokbokki today, with ramen. Never in her life had she left out of bed so quickly. Yes, she said. Quietly, of course. She didn't want her foul language to reach the ears of her still pure baby, who was sleeping peacefully with his little bum pointing upwards. Leaning over, she kissed the top of Scorpius's head before following Draco out of their bedroom. Their home was small and muggle-run, rather unlike the traditional pure-blood manners the two had grown up in. Recent breakthroughs in magical development, led by the young inventor Cho Chang, allowed wizards and witches to use magic in places surrounded by webs of electrical wiring, without accidentally causing a small nuclear explosion. So though the muggles living above and below them used their foreign electric devices ceaselessly, there was no imminent danger in using magic, thank Merlin. On the countertop were a few grocery bags, probably from when Draco had taken the morning to shop. Astoria, who knew absolutely fuck all about cooking, but enjoyed accompanying Draco nonetheless, hoisted herself onto the counter. Without speaking, Draco took out the mouth-watering ingredients from the bags. Sticky rice cakes, green onions, sesame oil and hot pepper paste, and red pepper flakes for the sauce, and anchovies, and dried kelp for the soup stock. And Astoria felt the warm embrace of familiarity settle around her shoulders. To people unfamiliar with them, she and Draco almost certainly appeared cold and unloving. After all, they were generally quiet and rarely displayed their affection for the world to see. These people were either blind as a bat or really fucking stupid. If they couldn't see it, then it wasn't her problem. Draco filled a pot with water and tossed in a handful of dried anchovies and a sheet of kelp before covering the pot, setting it on the stove, and lighting a flame underneath with his wand. Then he unexpectedly pulled a small pink card from his pocket and handed it to her. At first, Astoria thought it was a love letter from him, but then she noticed the handwriting. On the front, in painstakingly written letters, said, "To Mommy." The M's had a few extra humps, and the O and U were practically indistinguishable from each other, and all in all, the penmanship was quite terrible. But there was a lump forming in her throat anyway. There was something about her precious little toddler that just released uninvited feelings into her system. The fact that her somewhat illiterate child had written her a note in her 2-week absence was just, Merlin, you're enjoying that I'm about to cry, aren't you? Said Astoria somewhat grumpily, just as one tear eked out of the corner of her eye. And she hadn't even opened the bloody thing yet. Just a little, yes, he said, smiling with his eyes. He was silent for a few moments before saying, You know, Scorpius declared himself exhausted after writing just that, and went to take a nap. And the tears came. Draco knew that would make her cry in full, the arsehole. This was ridiculous. Before Scorpius, she never cried. After Scorpius, her heart was clogged with love and emotions to the point where tears had to escape. Otherwise, she would implode with suppressed feelings. I hate you, said Astoria, laughing through her tears. Draco just looked at her, his eyes glinting with amusement. Go on, open it. After wiping her stupid tears away, Astoria opened the little pink card. On the left side was a rather adorable drawing of their family, with a stick figure Scorpius, having quite the opinion of himself, positioned at the highest point on top of stick figure Astoria's shoulders, and with stick figures Draco and Susan on either side of her. On the right side was a lumpy, love Scorpius. He was originally going to write you a longer note, but after he discovered how tiring writing a mere to mummy was, he decided that a drawing would suffice. Lazy little bum. Astoria held it close to her heart for a moment before slipping it into the pocket of her pajamas. As the flavors of the stock began to thicken, Draco prepared the sauce for the teok baki, which never failed to make Astoria's mouth water. In a small bowl, he mixed together a large spoonful of the hot pepper paste, a heavy sprinkling of sugar, and a good pinch of the red pepper flakes, until it became smooth. He washed a few of the green onions to add as an additional flavor to the soup, before looking at Astoria. "You want to try your hand at cutting these?" he asked, a smile ghosting across his lips. "No," said Astoria. "Absolutely not." She wasn't sure when, but at some point between leaving Hogwarts and working at that Muggle bookstore where they met, Draco had learned to cook Korean food, the Muggle way. Sure, he cheated here and there and used his wand to expedite the process if he didn't feel like waiting, but still, his skills with knives were uncanny. Astoria, on the other hand, once nearly hacked off her finger. "You don't even have to chop these finely," said Draco. "Just 2-inch pieces." He pulled the knife off its magnetic rack with a sharp metallic ring. "Sometimes I think you actively try to corner me into making life-threatening mistakes," said Astoria, even as she hopped off the countertop and waltzed over to him. "Green onions are hardly life-threatening," he said, rolling his eyes and letting her take the knife in hand. "Dickhead," she said as she laughed. She kept her fingertips as far away from the knife tip as possible, and proceeded to slice perhaps the most inefficiently cut onions in the history of the world. Each piece took her a good 30 seconds, and she supposed Draco must have gotten slightly bored in the 5,000 fucking hours it took her to cut the onions, because he began telling her stories of the random shit Scorpius got up to in the 2 weeks she was gone. Each day had brought a new surprise, apparently. One morning he had been awakened by Scorpius getting into Draco's Muggle records, which consisted largely of American music from the 60s. Yes, Draco was that kind of arsehole, but Astoria loved him anyway. Scorpius, who could barely coordinate himself to use his own spoons without having a small breakdown, had somehow managed to play My Girl by the Temptations. So when Draco had rocketed out of the master bedroom in confusion, he'd been met with the sight of Scorpius bobbing up and down to the hit track, and miraculously managing not to trip all over himself. A few days later, Scorpius had managed to uncover a packet of Drubal's best blowing gum, except he had difficulties differentiating between digestible food and things that really should not be swallowed in high quantities, or really swallowed at all. So while Draco was showering, Scorpius had chewed and swallowed his way through the entire packet, staining the insides of his mouth a multitude of garish colors. After his shower, Draco had found Scorpius sitting forlornly in the living room, holding the empty packet of gum in front of him as though it would magically produce more. On another day, Scorpius had smeared finger paint on his light blue bedroom walls, a room he rarely used when Astoria was home, to the point where she wondered what the purpose of giving him that space was. Draco had gone to the Muggle hardware store to buy paint, green for Slytherin, after the indication that Scorpius wanted to get in touch with his artistic side. Instead, Scorpius had napped blissfully on his neglected bed, while Draco had painted over all the walls by himself. The next morning, the room had been turned a bright yellow. Astoria snorted, slow slices grinding to a complete stop as she responded. "Hufflepuff in the making. I know it. Susan will be so proud." "Unfortunately," said Draco. But despite his negativity, Astoria could hear the beginnings of a smile in his voice. "Imagine that. The son of two fierce Slytherins becoming a Hufflepuff. A hippogriff fucking attacked you in your second year of Hogwarts. I heard about it. The whole school heard about it. Whatever gene Scorpius got from you, fierce is not one of them. By the way, Hufflepuffs can be fierce too. Have you met Susan? Draco was silent, most likely thinking about that one time Susan had almost clobbered him with a frying pan because he'd been acting like a dumb shit. They were on good terms now, but after that incident, he'd refrained from insulting Hufflepuff to Susan's face again. Anyway, said Astoria as she resumed slicing the green onions, what else did our little Scorpius get up to? We learned that Scorpius had attempted eating a worm, which was at least an improvement on eating rocks. Progress, she said dryly. Then Draco began listing the more average accomplishments of Scorpius, learning the word for sink at last. He had always called sinks toilets for some strange reason, thus resulting in some major confusion while potty training. Managing to find a stuffed animal he'd lost before Astoria left, and writing, somewhat, the letter sitting gently in Astoria's pocket. Finally, Astoria finished slicing up the 3 green onions, and stepped aside to let Draco finish making the teokbokki. He took the sticky rice cakes out of their packaging and rinsed them under cold water until they separated cleanly from each other. Then he carefully placed them by the handful into the stock boiling on the stove, along with the chopped green onions. If you say anything about the unevenness of the onions, I will eat this teokbokki by myself, Astoria threatened, and Draco snapped his ready mouth shut. He then spooned the thick sauce into the pot, letting the flavors soak deep into the rice cakes. For the final finish, he took out a couple packets of ramen from the cabinet and added the dried noodles and soup packets to the scrumptious-smelling stew. Once everything had been stirred together, Draco let it all sit in order for the sauce to thicken. Already the heavenly smell of the sweet and spicy sauce was wafting through the air, and Astoria's mouth began to water at the thought of eating the deliciously chewy rice cakes. Then she remembered her little son. Oh, my dear fucking goodness, she said, slapping a hand over her cheek. I forgot about Scorpius. He's 2. He can't eat this. In the midst of her panic and self-loathing, Draco let out a rare laugh and walked over to Astoria, and she only had time to smile at him confusedly before he tilted her face toward him and kissed her gently on her eyelids, her cheeks, her nose. She sighed contentedly as he wrapped his arms around her. She leaned into him. I missed you, he said, pressing a kiss, a smile onto her temple. She treasured those smiles. I'm so glad you're home. I missed your swears and your impatience for everyone except Scorpius. I'm so happy you're here to bless both Susan and I with, well, you. In any case, don't worry about Scorpius. I'll cook an egg for him, sunny side up. Scorpius is so lucky you're his father. Otherwise, that poor child would go hungry each day, Astoria said, looking up at Draco with a teasing smile. And as she saw his beautiful smile return hers, her stomach fluttered warmly, and she squeezed his torso tightly. There was no life she would rather have. Even with the scars left on her mind, she wouldn't trade her life for the world. She had Susan, the funniest, kindest, most nurturing person alive, with the most beautiful smile in the world. She had Draco, a level-headed father who was so refreshingly honest with her, night and day. She had little Scorpius, who did enough weird shit to keep her entertained for every hour of the day, and who had grown to take up her entire universe. She had the most satisfying job in the world, hunting fugitive Death Eaters, and she had the best coworkers and friends in the world. At least as soon as they'd let go of their complete and utter disbelief that a daughter of pureblood fanatics was joining. And her happiness was part of the problem. With that, her good mood fluttered away. She sighed and stepped away from Draco, hoisting herself onto the countertop once again. He stood in front of her, looking at her with those sharp, questioning eyes. And Astoria found herself blurting, Do horrible people deserve to be happy like this? Because sometimes that was all she could think about. Years after the war, this was always lurking at the back of her mind. I don't know, said Draco, clearly at a loss for an answer. I don't know. I think you have to remember to separate horrible actions from horrible people, and that people who've done horrible things in the past may not be. This calm, well-spoken husband of hers was stumbling over himself, and if that didn't signify that Astoria had hit on a difficult subject for the both of them, she didn't know what would. She looked at him, saw his guilt lurking on his shoulders, behind his eyes, in the hard corners of his mouth. They both suffered now, him due to his blanket prejudice that had influenced his young adult behavior so heavily, and her because she had campaigned so mercilessly to save the members of Dumbledore's army, even if they were irreversibly traumatized in the process. Just because they'd been young did not mean they weren't still responsible, and Astoria knew this, recited this, every fucking day. Though Draco had never really spoken of his feelings on the matter, she could see it, plain as day. It was in the looks of painful tenderness he gave Scorpius, as though he couldn't believe that such an angel demon had been blessed upon a family as crooked as his. Astoria felt the same way. Living true happiness was fucking exhausting. After the war had ended, Astoria had finished schooling while Draco was immediately ushered into a government-sponsored re-educational program. From there, the two of them had taken wildly different routes, with Draco continuing to follow his therapist-recommended activities while quietly paying for the damages caused by his family, and with Astoria throwing herself headfirst into the task force launched by the Ministry to catch Death Eater fugitives all around the world. Still, Ginny Weasley haunted Astoria's dreams, and Draco's classmates haunted his. I don't know, Draco said again, in response to Astoria's question. We need to just continue as we are for the rest of our lives. Never stop working to fix what we did. I don't know. She didn't know either. Being this vulnerable all the time was not exactly on her list of priorities, but between spending time with the two loves of her life, she always somehow found herself doubting. It was fucking terrible. Suddenly, a high-pitched whine meandered closer as soft footsteps approached the kitchen, until there was a little toddler standing grumpily at the entryway of the kitchen. Scorpius was dressed in a bright yellow dragon onesie, a delightful type of pajamas that Draco had discovered one day while shopping for Muggle clothes, and the hood was flopped messily over his blonde hair. That onesie was green when I got it, said Draco, staring at his son with suspicion. And it was green this morning. Stop trying to fight our son's inner Hufflepuff, said Astoria warmly, sliding off the countertop to scoop up her child. Complaining as he was, Scorpius was still the light of her life, and she'd be damned before she let a simple whine stop her from cuddling her child. Good morning, Scorpius. It's nearing 11:30 a.m., you two. Both of you function on a time zone somewhere off in Canada. As a greeting, Draco kissed Scorpius on the forehead. What's wrong today? Said Astoria, giving Scorpius a little squeeze. Did we abandon you? Scorpius just pouted, and the dragon hood fell further over his eyes. Chuckling, Draco turned back to the stove, where the teokbokki ramen was bubbling quietly. With a wave of his wand, Draco extinguished the fire and levitated the still bubbling pot over to the small breakfast table nestled in the corner of the kitchen. Breathing in deeply, Astoria relished the comforting aroma of Korean food at its finest. We should probably cook an egg for Scorpius now, she said. And by we, I suppose you mean just me, said Draco, rolling his eyes slightly before turning back to the stove. But he was smiling. Is Susan going to be coming over later today? She's bringing more books from the trip to the library yesterday, right? Yes, she is, said Astoria. And perhaps there was something extra magical about the thought of Susan, because as soon as her name was uttered, the entire family felt something lift from the air. And Scorpius let out a bubbly, hiccuping laugh, and Astoria smiled and tickled him ceaselessly, and Draco snorted at their antics while cracking an egg into a pan, and the guilt would never leave them. That was okay, because though their mistakes would remain forever, they, at least, were capable of changing a little today. For now, that was all right. And so that was chapter 2 of Lazy Days. Like I was saying before, if you are just joining us, that story was written by Ava, aka Just a Willow Tree, and it actually received first place, as I'm sure you can understand why if you've read the story, in Forever Dreaming's uh, Domesticity Challenge, which was hosted on the HP Fanfic Talk forums. You can find the link to the story that I muddled through reading a little more poorly than usual tonight, which will take you directly to this chapter of the story. And you can find the full story on the HP Fanfic Talk archives. So we are fortunate to be joined right now with us live for another session of Fic Night, the author of the story, none other than, as I've said, Ava, aka Just a Willow Tree. And so I will also be keeping tabs on the live chat that we have going as this is broadcast on our YouTube channel. But I'm going to start by saying hello, Ava. And I want to ask you some questions about the story, starting with what made you choose this relationship between Astoria, Draco, and Susan, and of course Scorpius, as the focus of the story. I think she's with us. I'm gonna try to poke her, perhaps. Well, while I am poking Ava, what I will start by saying is sharing my thoughts on the story. One of the things that I found so effective about the story, from my perspective, was the authenticity. Um, and what I mean by that, at least in part, is that in addition to the very unique dynamics that were presented in the story, what we also had was unique characterizations of Draco and Astoria. Drastoria is a popular ship next gen because it, of course, was revealed to be a canon ship. But often in fan fiction, authors seem to imagine Astoria not just as this alternative kind of a pure blood who was not caught up in blood prejudice, blood purity, and was not actually on the side of Voldemort in his quest for world domination. But as someone who's sort of this like soft, soothing, kind of, oh, Draco, comforting influence on Draco as a tortured soul. Um, Draco obviously is a more stoic character, owing, I think, much to how he was raised by Lucius and Narcissa. And that's built in, I think, more canonically defined and sound in this story. But Ava doesn't shy away either from presenting that kind of demeanor, that kind of person in a different light where you can see through the body language the slight peaks. You can see the emotion behind it, and the emotion in how he interacts with Astoria, who he is obviously very much in love with. Um, for Astoria's part, obviously she is the source of most of the foul mouth sort of thinking and dialogue, which also uh, sort of contrasts with not just how we think of her, but how we think. I think, or I say we, referring primarily to just fan fiction authors in general. How fanfic authors tend to think of purebloods. I think there's this conception, and I know I'm certainly guilty of it, that purebloods, even on into the next gen era, even those who grew up alongside or around Harry's age in the Hogwarts area, and they're the parents of next gen, the couples of next gen, and they are we seem to have this idea that they're all raised in this particular way, that they all are going to act this particular way. Um, I think sort of comparing to high society. I don't pretend to know personally English high society, but it reminds me a lot having relatives from the southern US who like to go, well, still live in the southern US, but we tend to have the high society, upper class folks around here. I imagine we're seeing as well, because I imagine that high society, upper class childhood and upbringing is probably similar, given our very entwined histories as people. But they have these ways, these traditions that people have to act, at least outwardly, publicly, just so. And this kind of turns that on its head. But I am going to see now, if Ava can come through. I think the issue was that maybe having some technical difficulties. Um, she looks like she like, amp up the volume a little bit. Ava, can you hear us? Can we hear you? It looks like not at the moment. So I don't know if we are going to be able to get through, and ask all of the questions that I would have loved to ask, but I'm going to take a moment here, listen to the proverbial crickets chirping while Ava and I try to figure out this connection. And while we're troubleshooting the sound, I'm also going to try to use a workaround, tapping up the group chat. We are like I said, still doing some sound troubleshooting, but we may be able to communicate questions, answers, on the outside of the group chat. It won't be as streamlined, of course, but um, but it may provide us a solution. So we'll try that for a few more minutes, and we'll see where we get, in the end with that approach. So I have, the first question. We are working it out in the group chat. So I will unfortunately have to speak for both of us. I have tried Ridiculous Voices before. I forget who I read. I tried to read some story. I think it was Pix's story in an accent. Um, that lamppost is a keeper. But I'm not going to attempt any. Not going to attempt a female voice for Ava here, so you're just going to have to deal with me. Um, but I return to that question, kind of about the relationship dynamic that's at the core of this chapter of the story, kind of confining it to Draco, Astoria, Scorpius, because that's really what this chapter focuses on. Um, but uh, Ava's answer was that her inspiration was largely from the love of children, first and foremost. But mostly she loved the idea of Draco being a super domestic father, like a stay at home dad, which is something that's really far removed from his typical pure blooded upbringing, which definitely makes sense with the characterization. Um, I will ask next, how badly did I just completely butcher the name of what he was cooking? I really committed hard to it, uh, Teokbokki, but I have to get the answer of how it's supposed to be said. so that if I've offended anybody with my ignorance, I can correct the situation. Apparently, it is Takbaki. I think I've gotten that right. Takbaki. Now I'm told. So that sounds a lot better than me trying to fancify it. So thank you. Uh, the story is a much educational experience as well in learning about at least that particular dish. Um, why choose that dish? That is, I think, an easy next question to ask. Fair enough, because Korean food is super delicious and Ava really loves it. There is no other reason other than her love for Korean food. Confession, I've never had any Korean food um, ever. I have, of course, had Chinese, or what American restaurants pretend is Chinese food. God only knows it's probably a terrible, um, just a terrible imitation. And Japanese food, which proved once again that I am terrible with chopsticks, um, really incompetent. You can ask Treacle Tart, aka Caitlin, and I've gotten that wrong when she returns from her world tour. But we've also gotten a follow up that Astoria is Korean in Ava's headcanon. So that kind of fit, creating this opportunity for Draco to be good at cooking Korean food. Um, I have to follow up and ask, is that something that Draco actively, I'm assuming it's something he actively cultivated um, to please Astoria? Was that something that happened when Draco went stay-at-home dad mode, or was it uh, part of Draco's seductive courtship? And the answer is that Draco was already trying to distance himself from his pure-blooded roots, understandably so, after the war. So he took up cooking like a muggle, using a stove and a flame like we have to suffer through if we want delicious tuckbucky, or if we want a fried egg. Um, he already knew some Korean cuisine, I'm told, but then he met Astoria and actually bothered developing his skills further. Um, classic, classic caring guy move. I mean, I wouldn't have considered Draco to evolve into a caring guy, but that is how you may know that a dude really loves you, if he picks up a whole nother culture's food and learns how to cook it amazingly, so that you bolt out of bed with an expletive like Astoria, just in sheer excitement about how good he is at it. Um, so well done, Draco. Ava, can you shed some light on the bookstore meeting? I know I kind of jumped in just in chapter two myself with this story, so I don't know if that's addressed in chapter one. But for people who may be hearing chapter two, kind of mostly out of context of things that were addressed in chapter one, um, I'm told no. So, chapter one is about Astoria's relationship with Susan, which makes the chapters aptly named. If you visit the story in the archive, you'll see that chapter one is titled Susan, chapter two is titled Draco, and so that's the focus. So tell us about the missing moment then, the bookstore meeting. What is the deal with the Muggle bookstore? So the core is that Ava wanted the thrust of Astoria and Draco's relationship to emerge from a non-wizarding sort of starting point, and Astoria, who is crazy, intense, fugitive hunting horror post-war, was just taking a break, working in a Muggle bookstore, taking a break from horror training, which sounds like it would be a really relaxing way to break out of training to be a sort of fugitive hunting commando. For Draco's side, he was going through therapy from everything that he went through as a teenager, which God knows, love him or hate him, was a lot for any child, teenager, otherwise to go through. And part of the therapy was just to visit a place that he had never been to before that would hopefully help remove him from all of the memories that triggered negativity and triggered things that he was trying to overcome. And so he went to not just any bookstore, but a Muggle bookstore where there would not even be magical texts to remind him of that past, which I guess could have a connection to Hogwarts if it were just a standard wizarding bookstore, since we know that they are out there slanging uh, textbooks. Um, I have also been told, slipped in this answer here very cunningly, that perhaps, I don't want to put too much pressure, but perhaps there will be a one shot about the meeting in the Muggle bookstore. So folks should keep their eyes peeled on the archive. Um, to give us a sneak peek, not that it has to be written, but if it were to be written, um, are we looking at uh, are we looking at a slow burning multi-visit situation where things are touchy to start with, or are we going to get a Muggle bookstore meet cute? All right, we're going to get a meet cute. I hope I'm using that word correctly. People throw it around a lot, so I don't. You know, I have seen a College Humor video parodying it, and I'm doing my best to use it. So hopefully, I'm nailing it for the audience out there. Ava said she loves both slow burns and meet cutes, but thinks meet cutes are the best. So, so it had to be that. Um, how did Astoria get this salty vocab? How did she get the nasty mouth as a pureblood? So the story behind the profanity laden Astoria is that uh, it is born out of another one shot that Ava wrote about Astoria from wartime, where sort of despite the high upper class stuff that I was incoherently rambling um, about pure blood society, the children, like any children, like being away from their parents where they can cuss like sailors to their heart's content. Lord knows I was a foul mouthed teenager and college student, at least probably up until I don't know. But Astoria was no different. Uh, well, I'm told she is different. She's more foul mouthed than the others, which we can see. Part of what Ava describes as her callous personality, and so experiencing wartime, which can obviously provoke intense reactions, intense emotions, intense and awful experiences. Um, Seems to, as Ava's explained it, to certainly jive with intense language, which I think anybody's experience will tell us tends to match intense emotion, intense experience, for better or worse. Um, I think with my ramblings, that is all I have. Ava, is there anything else that you would like to share about Lazy Days, or share about aspects of the story that I haven't touched on or have been too much of a bum to ask you about? Well, apparently the hard part was the fact that I draw the line at 5,000 words for Fic Night, so that Ava could not submit the whole story Lazy Days, and trying to decide whether to go with Duristoria or Ustuzin. I Which do you prefer, Ava? Sustoria, Ustuzin, Sustoria. There you go. Next, second time was the charm. Um, but I, I will admit that that having read chapter two, I'm going to have to go back and read chapter one now because there's so much. There's so many little, particularly the end of the story, these references to Susan and how great it was that she's going to be coming back and that she's still in all their lives, um, which certainly is addressed out at the beginning of the story, because ultimately the story does involve polyamory, which is something that I think is refreshing to see on the archive, because it's an aspect of identity that I think often goes unexplored, for sure, and when people do look at it, often goes very misunderstood. I think I mentioned this before in a previous Fic Night, where there was a polyamorous relationship. I want to say it involved Draco, Hermione, and Blaze Zabini. If I'm remembering right, I'm forgetting the story right now, which jives with what I'm going to say next, which is I had the pleasure of reading a story my um, my freshman year of college in an honors studies course that explored polyamory, and I've always found it. Like I said, I think it seems very unexplored and very misunderstood out in the world today. So I am sure when I read chapter one in conjunction with chapter two, that it's really going to add a whole new dimension to the reading for me. The writing of chapter two is obviously immense quality, and I think, like I said, I think it's just going to add a whole nother level of depth to all the characters. Um, and I am looking forward to reading the rest of the story for sure. So next, I want to just apologize for all of the technical difficulties. Probably my fault for not getting the broadcast waiting room up soon enough to make sure that we had worked out all of the technical kinks. But I want to very much thank Ava for bearing with me, being willing to use the group chat, and all of you who are watching or will watch. I want to thank y'all as well for bearing with the silences and bearing with rambling Kevin tonight. So thank you. Check out the story. Check out the entire story. The link to this chapter, chapter two, as I've said, is in the description of the video, which will load to the channel shortly after we conclude the live stream. But from there, on the HPFT archive, hpfanfictalk.com archive, you can easily make your way to the whole story and get the whole picture of Astoria, Susan, and Draco, in the huge parts that they are of each other's lives. So thank you for sharing this story with us. Congratulations on winning the challenge. And it was an honor and a privilege to feature your story for Fic Night. And hopefully you had fun too, and we will get a chance to see you around throwing your name in the hat for future Fic Nights as we continue to chase for the first time a repeat author. This is Kevin, aka Title Dragon, signing off.